So we were talking about the shift from Old Kingdom to Middle Kingdom, and how the judgment of the dead did not occur in the Old Kingdom, and it was something that was instituted in the Middle Kingdom as a punishment for those, especially those nobles who had departed from Mot, from truth, from the way, and disrupted Egyptian civilization and its smooth functioning with the anarchy of following their own individual interests away from Pharaoh. So in an attempt to re-centralize the power to the Pharaoh, the judgment of the dead was invented as a new kind of threat by the Egyptian priesthood to put fear in the hearts of those individuals who put their own selfish interests ahead of the Egyptian state. And that's how it came about. Also, in the pyramid text, we find the conception that the Pharaoh has 14 different Kas. The Ka is the double of the body, as we know it later on. It's an exact duplicate physically of the body. It's an etheric duplicate of the body that hangs around the tomb and that has to be fed actually with food offerings in order to keep it alive. But it's very different from the Ba. There is apparently in the texts, the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom, the Ba does not exist. It's never even mentioned. Later, the Ba is that aspect of the astral body which can transform. It's normally pictured as a human-headed bird, but it can change shape and turn into any shape it wants and flit about through the astral plane in the afterlife. The conception of the Ba isn't there. You won't find it referred to in the pyramid texts at all. And apparently the Pharaoh had 14 Kas, which is a little bit mysterious. We're not sure that we understand why that is. We know that in the burials at Abydos from the First Dynasty, there are these gigantic enclosures that are buried, and one of them is buried with 14 boats that's with it, that seems to be somehow connected with this idea of the Pharaoh having 14 Kas. So the religious conceptions change, and then of course even in the Old Kingdom itself we see the evolution towards the solar cults, away from, in the First and Second Dynasties, the lunar cults of Osiris and the emphasis on the nighttime sky. It's still there even in the Third Dynasty with the first complex, the Great Pyramid that's associated with the Pharaoh Zoser, which is laid out on a north-south axis and is aligned to the circumpolar constellations that whirl around the pole star, which at that time was Thuban, and which the Pharaoh's Kas, or at least some of them, were thought to fly up to and join the circumpolar stars, because they never set below the horizon and they are therefore eternal, like the soul of the Pharaoh, who would go up to the pole star and join these stars twittering around the pole star. And that complex is laid out on a north-south axis and seems to be primarily oriented to the nighttime sky. By the time we get to the Fourth Dynasty with the great famous pyramids of Khafre and Menkaure and so forth, the layout of the pyramid complex itself changes, and it orients to an east-west axis. It loses its northern emphasis, and the emphasis becomes put on the cult temple that faces the east, where the sun rises and sets. So there's an east-west axis now to the pyramid complex that indicates a shift from the lunar cults of the nighttime sky to the daytime religions of the god Re, and we can even see the word Re coming in with Menkau Re. The solar cults are coming in the Fourth Dynasty, and by the time of the Fifth Dynasty, as Spengler points out here, they have completely triumphed over the cold, lunar, nighttime cults of astrology in the nighttime sky, with the rise of the Re sun temples and the invention of the obelisk. It's basically, the obelisk is a frozen beam of sunlight that has come down to the earth. It's a petrified ray from the sun. And so Re becomes associated with the Fifth Dynasty great solarization process. So even in that respect, we can see these eternal truths changing over time. James Henry Breasted was the great master of Egyptian culture forms, who follows in his book The Development of Egyptian Religious Thought, shows you how these transformations take place. So I highly recommend that for anyone. Anyone, by the way, who is interested in the best introduction to Egyptian culture is Alexander Moray's book, The Nile and Egyptian Civilization, which was written about the time Spengler was working here. It's still one of the best introductions, overall introductions to the religious mentality of Egypt that I have ever found. But that's how these ideas change over time. Basically, what Spengler then goes on to do in this chapter is to talk about the Gothic, to talk about the evolution of the morphology of religious forms as they evolve within the context of the metabolism of a civilization from spring to winter. He starts talking about the Gothic springtime forms, the Mary cults and the devil cults, and how deathly serious they were taken, and how, to the Gothic mentality, the world was populated by real demons, And when the Gothic man looked out on the world, these were not myths and metaphors as they've come later. They were really believed to be real entities. There was a deathly seriousness about all of this. But then the main point of the chapter comes when he talks about the rise of Cromwell and Puritanism, or the rise of the phenomenon of Puritanism, which he believes to be a phenomenon that happens in each of the high civilizations when they reach about the midpoint of their development, about midway through, about 500 years into the development. The culture shifts to a puritanical form of religiosity, which is a spark of the deep piety carried over from the springtime that is now tempered and encrusted with a layer of late city Baroque intellect. It becomes very sterile and intellectualized, so it's a sort of combination of piety and sterile intellectualism that comes up now with Cromwell and his puritanical movement that Spengler sees as being homologous with Muhammad and the rise of Islam, which was similarly fanatical and puritanical, and with the Pythagorean movement. In India, this will turn out to be Jainism, which is about the equivalent there. And in each case, they are very fanatical religions. They are deathly serious. There's no sense of humor about them at all, as there is, let's say, in the artwork of Peter Bruegel and Hieronymus Bosch, which still manages to represent this old world of demons and witches with a sense of humor and playfulness. That's gone now, and he compares, for example, Cromwell and his Ironsides against the king, against the royalists represented by Charles I. He compares that with what happened in the case of the Crotonites. Pythagoras had set up his school at Croton in southern Italy, and the Crotonites' destruction of the Sybarites in the city of Sybaris. The Pythagoreans had influenced the government of Croton, and they had gone against the Sybarites, whom they regarded as purely worldly, too worldly and not religious enough, and they were simply destroyed, and Sybaris was wiped out by the Crotonites under the influence of Pythagoras. Just as Spengler says, one of the criticisms of Cromwell against the king was not just the departure in dogma, but also that Charles's approach was regarded as too worldly and not pious, not purely pious enough. And he also says there's a certain aspect where Milton's Paradise Lost is a similar, it's equivalent to the Quran in terms of its puritanical its puritanical sensibility. It's very similar. In Jainism, we get the same thing, except that it's not allied with a military movement or a state formation. With Jainism, as it may have been founded by Mahavira in about the 7th century BC, it is a religion not concerned at all with the gods. It's a religion purely concerned with the jiva, which is the soul idea there that becomes infected with karma. From every act you do, whether good or bad, doesn't matter. Everything you do creates karma that infects the jiva, and the idea is to purge the karma out of the jiva by simply not eating anymore, by not you start with vegetarianism and then you gradually work your way up to not eating. And that becomes the basis of salvation in Jainism. It's a very sterile, rationalistic approach to religion that Spengler says will prepare the way for Buddhism, which is a nihilistic religion. And so the point becomes that Puritanism paves the way then for the coming in the next phase of the Socratic man. Puritanism is the bridge between the deep, purely religious piety of the springtime forms, in which, he says, philosophy, when it first appears as scholasticism, is still the handmaid of faith. And the whole point of philosophy, when it appears, whether it's in the case of the Brahmanas in the Vedic period, or in the case of the early philosophers in Greece, it still appears as a justification of faith. It's in service to faith. Later, as it appears in the late form, the late city form, it's no longer, philosophy is no longer a justification of faith, but it turns against it and begins to sterilize it out of existence. And he says the bridge between these two then is Puritanism, which is sort of half deep piety and half the application of a citified intellect now. The city has come into power, and during the Baroque, it's the grand period of its power that it comes in, and it's beginning to sterilize the religious sensibility with these concepts now, with this conceptualization. And he says that in the 17th century, of course, we begin to get the rise of rationalism, and rationalism slowly will be regarded as the only proper application of the intellect by the time of Hume and Rousseau and Voltaire in the 18th century, in which rationalism becomes all. It becomes the absolute thing, and anyone who still practices religious forms or religious sensibilities is generally regarded to be either uneducated, uncivilized, or insane. And so this association that happens during the period of the Socratic man of irrationalism, or at least of a religious sensibility with the mad, is a process that happens. You can see it happening in the 17th century, and Foucault talks about this in his great book, Madness and Civilization, which, by the way, if you decide to read, don't read the abridged version of that. Read the big 1,000-page version of it that goes into all the details, where Foucault talks about the great confinement of the 17th century, when the very idea of madness was invented. It was an invention of the 17th century that was the counter-concept to the rise of rationalism, and the mad were then suddenly seen as no longer sane, whereas in the no longer sane, or no longer breaking through to a higher kind of reason. The mad in the Middle Ages were associated with illumination and insight, as you can still see in vestigial titles like Erasmus's In Praise of Folly, or as you can see where the fool in Lear, who still has a greater insight than all the other characters. Madness was originally associated with this idea that the mad were in possession of a higher truth, or could see things that those who were merely sane or merely rational could not. But the transitional text, of course, is Don Quixote, in which the older piety, the old chivalrous piety, the grand mentality of the Grail quest, is now seen as something to be ridiculed and laughed at, and is associated with a form of madness. That's the transitional text between the older springtime deep piety and the high megalopolitan rationalism of the Voltaire, the Rousseau, and the Hume, the Socrates, Buddha, and the different civilizations, Confucius, that we get as the end result of this. So Don Quixote is the transitional text there. So then the rationalism becomes, by the time you get to the rationalism of the Enlightenment, and he says, note that for both Socrates and Buddha, suffering is the result of ignorance. For Socrates, the main thing is to know thyself, which is another way of saying know how to philosophize, and not knowing, remaining in a state of ignorance creates suffering. Same thing for the Buddha, he says, that suffering is equated with ignorance. Ignorance, namely, of the Four Noble Truths in his case, which is then the cure for suffering, the attainment of nirvana, which he says is basically a Hindu equivalent of the Stoic ataraxia. So this becomes the process of extermination that takes place, that Puritanism lays the groundwork for, and then we move into the high civilization, in which rationalism becomes the great rule. Then we shift over into the megalopolitan atheistic mentality, in which the general population, the Socratic mentality, spreads to the general population, and everyone becomes rationalistic as a matter of course. And anyone who practices, the early springtime religiosity is either a peasant or an idiot. This is the kind of association of a Christopher Hitchens or a Sam Harris has, who equates religion with fanatics, with idiots, basically. There's that failure to understand what the function of religion is, what it was originally and initially. During the megalopolitan period, then it's ridiculed and it's chased off the stage. But Spengler says there is a fashion that will develop, and it developed in late Republican Rome with the Isis cults coming in at the same time as Chaldean astrology, in which the great tension of the megalopolitan intellect has to find some kind of relief, some kind of that's equivalent to the sports and the stadiums and so forth. The intellectual relief then is found in which religion becomes a mere fashion. It becomes a thing of fashion, a plaything for the idle and the rich. It's not really taken seriously, and he says that this is the equivalent in our time of theosophy, which would now be the New Age, and basically this would be the New Age mentality, which is fundamentally shallow and which regards religiosity as merely a plaything, a pastime, a sort of game of let's pretend. This was common amongst the people, the intellects of late Republican Rome. It's common in our time now, and it's common to Boulder Buddhism and the basic New Age mentality, in which all the old esoteric, deeply pious religious forms are simply regarded as playthings, toys, basically for the rich. Whereas he says materialism is shallow, but at least it's honest. This kind of New Age mentality is both shallow and dishonest, so it's fraudulent, basically. And I think that's basically what what is wrong with the New Age mentality. It's very shallow, very superficial, and it's very fashionable. It's very of the moment.